Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Today, I wanted to talk about the subject of pacifism. I have never been a pacifist, never. Leftists generally are not pacifists. People who tend to be pacifists tend to be liberals, progressives, people who are just opposed to war in principle. How can a pacifist, how can a communist be a pacifist? Answer me that question. Seriously, I'm not a pacifist. Pacifism is a very individualistic approach to ending war, and it doesn't work, or at least it doesn't work that well. I mean, if I decide that I am not going to enter into a war, say I become a conscientious objector and there is a war. Well, now here in the United States, there is no draft. There is no likelihood of there being a draft. Most people in the Pentagon, in the House, in the Department of Defense, most high-ranked military officers are generally opposed to a draft. Because in a draft, you end up with a lot of people in the military who don't want to be there. In other words, you end up with a non-professional army, and professional armies fight a lot better than non-professional armies. Now, what I personally believe, for what it's worth, is that there should be some type of service required of people where they live, whether it's national, international, regional, whatever. That service could be military. That service could be Peace Corps. That service could be volunteering to serve one's own community in any one of a number of different nonprofit agencies. Even myself, perhaps I should say especially myself, given my age and my work status, which is zero. I'm a retired 67-year-old guy. I would be overjoyed to have the opportunity to engage in some type of national service. I would not be overjoyed to be in the military. I don't think I would fit very well. My disposition as an autistic, I don't think I would fit very well into the military. If other people want to do that, that's their business. I'm not going to criticize them, but it's not something that I think would suit me. But pacifism basically is, to me, a kind of coward's way out. Maybe that's unfair. I shouldn't perhaps label all pacifists as cowards, only some of them. But I know, for example, when I was in my teens, and there was a very good chance that I was going to be drafted into the Indochina War, the Vietnam War, that I got together with some friends of mine, and I decided that I was not going to fight in the Vietnam War. I did not want to kill any Vietnamese soldiers. No, not me. So we decided that if we were drafted, that we would flee to Canada. And at that time, Canada was very welcoming of Americans who did not want to fight in the Vietnam War. That has changed, and I doubt if there was something like the Vietnam War right now that Canada would be as welcoming. But back then they were, and I was very grateful for that. Now, I was not happy about moving to a colder climate, but that was the least of my concerns. I would have probably gone to Canada at that time. But although I considered myself to be a communist beginning at around the age of 12, I was not really an educated communist. I really didn't know much about communism. I was a leftist, but I was a very uneducated leftist. And so I thought that pacifism was a good thing to do. And in some respects, considering the nature of the Indochina War, honestly, I mean, who would want to fight and kill Viet Cong? I had two students, brother and sister, in one of my classes about 3 years ago before I retired last year. Both of them were Vietnamese. They were here on student visas in the United States. And they asked me, "Did you ever fight in Vietnam?" And I said, "No, I was too young. If I were 2 years older, then I might have been drafted, but even then, most likely President Nixon would not have sent me to Vietnam. They stopped sending people to Vietnam before that time. So I might have done some other kind of work. And that I probably would not have objected to. That would have been okay with me, as long as I was not killing Viet Cong. That's what I said to them. And I said, but if I were drafted, as I just mentioned, I would have escaped to Canada. I told my parents that. They were not overjoyed by it, but they understood it. At that time, the sentiment in the US for the war among older Americans had shifted, whereas originally during the Johnson administration, there was a kind of overwhelming, I would say almost a kind of knee-jerk support for the Indochina conflict. That support had kind of withered away. Most people did not support the Vietnam War anymore. Nixon knew that. When Nixon first planned to end the Indochina conflict, Henry Kissinger, according to the story that's told, and I can't verify it, went into Nixon's office and started crying and pleading with President Nixon to please not end the Indochina conflict. Well, that was Henry Kissinger, an unindicted war criminal. Who cares what Henry Kissinger said? I certainly did not care. And I didn't hear that story until many, many years later. And I kind of laughed because it kind of fit with my understanding of the character of Henry Kissinger, and his character was really, in my opinion, not that great. So he wanted to continue the war in Vietnam. Nixon honestly wanted to continue the war in Vietnam too. But he saw that American support was dwindling and that there really was no appetite for a continued war in Vietnam, a war that honestly the United States was losing. So he cut the ties, he cut the cord, and ended the Vietnam War. And immediately, at least for a brief period, President Nixon became a national hero. That, of course, that didn't last very long, given the Watergate hearings. But at that moment, I remember, I was alive then, he was briefly a national hero. A lot of people looked up to him. Finally, someone who ended the Vietnam War. Back in 1968, when the Nixon-Agnew ticket was running against the Humphrey-Muskie ticket, I was a member of the Students' Democratic Coalition. We were a new leftist coalition, a national new leftist coalition that began in junior high school, today middle school, and ended on the college and university levels. We very openly opposed the Vietnam War, very openly opposed it. We would go to demonstrations against the Vietnam War. We saw it as an atrocity, which it was. Look at the relations between Vietnam and the US now. The relations are good. What a waste. What a waste of money. What a waste of resources. And above all, what a waste of human lives in the Indochina conflict. So Nixon had no choice. He ended the war. And that simply scrapped everything. A lot of people were upset, and a lot of people, myself, were ecstatic. But my answer, personal answer, and the personal answers of most of my friends who were male, was simply to go to Canada. Pacifism. The problem with pacifism, to be more specific, is that it really doesn't solve any structural problems. War is a structural problem. Pacifism is an individual answer to a structural problem. They don't fit. You can't solve a structural problem with pacifism. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's simply a waste of time. I didn't know that at the time. In fact, I didn't realize that till many years later. By then, the war was long gone, and I was a much more informed and educated communist than I was back then, when I still regarded myself as a part of the New Left, and then eventually as a Marxist-Leninist Titoist. And then I went through a variety of other tendencies after that, ending up now, as anybody who has been watching my videos knows, a Maoist-Third worldist. My second time as a Maoist-Third worldist. So that is my view of pacifism. It's not that I oppose the intention behind it. The intention is good. Stop war. We all wanted to stop war. All of us, in my chapter of the Students' Democratic Coalition, were in favor of nuclear disarmament. All of us were. None of us wanted to see the world go up in flames, go up in a mushroom cloud. That was the only logical solution, the only logical answer that really could be proposed at that time for ending humanity. Ultimately, was a nuclear war. That's what likely would have happened had there not been negotiations between the United States, other Western countries, and the former Soviet Union. That prevented further escalation at that time of nuclear weapons. Now, we have long since backtracked. There is no more Soviet Union. There's now Russia and its allies. They have been building up their nuclear arsenals, plus there are a lot of countries like North Korea, Israel, arguably Iran, which has nuclear weapons. And indeed they should. Why not? Although I hate the idea of nuclear war, when you look back on history, what is the only country to have ever used a nuclear device? It was the United States. on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There are still, to this day, some survivors, if you can call them survivors, of that war, who are completely mutilated as a result of being hit by that bomb. Now, admittedly, the US did not know exactly what would happen when they dropped those bombs. They didn't know, but they should have. They should have known. Nuclear proliferation is a horrible thing, and I hope it ends tomorrow, but not through pacifism, through communism, through revolution by the third world. We may, in the first world, do ourselves in. Maybe. Maybe not, but maybe. The third world, I think, will remain. And they are the only realistic solution I think we have at this point to really ending the war system, the war business, which exists in the world today. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.